Warning, the following contains spoilers for the Twilight of Wolumonde and Mansfield break events in Arknights, as well as a minor mention of the events in Part 0 and a slight spoiler for the Lingering Echoes event. This video is also mostly made for the sake of comparing and contrasting the writing quality of these two events, so there will be opinions aside from the usual brief summary. If this all sounds fine to you, watch on. Alright, last time we were here, we discussed the first steps of Arknight's main story. While we certainly will be back to cover the rest of the main plot, I figure we'll take a quick detour to talk about the other major part of Arknight's story, the events. As with most gacha games, the events are a way to give the audience a break from the main story, expand their knowledge of the game's wider setting, and introduce new characters for the players to burn all of their hoarded rolls on. However, as I mentioned in the last video, Arknights is a mixed bag of writing quality, and that extends into its events even to this day. Some of them are incredibly well-paced masterworks that can compete with the main story on its best day, and some of them are ungodly slogs through pacing that would make a narcoleptic sloth beg for the sweet release of death. We'll be covering two events today that find themselves on the opposite end of this scale, and if you're even slightly familiar with Arknight's events, you're gonna be able to guess which is which. Today we'll be delivering a brief summary of both Twilight of Wolumonde and Mansfield Break, then looking at what one does right and the other does extremely egregiously wrong. Let's start with Twilight. Meet Folinik and Suzerain, two Rhodes Island operators who have traveled to the titular town of Wolumonde in order to find out what happened to operator Atro, Folinik's good friend. However, the town passed a little too close to a dangerous catastrophe, which damaged its mobility systems, meaning it's dead in the water, and much like how Stark said in that one series with a definitely satisfying conclusion, winter is coming, and this winter won't be solved in a single episode. Also, the town has recently suffered a pretty brutal fire on the outskirts, which killed a number of citizens. Also, again, because of the fire, tensions are starting to skyrocket between the infected and uninfected townsfolk, and to top it all off, a small cell of reunion-affiliated Sarkaz have just arrived on the outskirts of town. The bulk of the event follows a handful of characters from the town in addition to our operators. In fact, in a few ways, our operators aren't really the main focus of the story. Instead, this event seeks to tell the story of the entire town as a collective group. Our main eyes from this group are Schultz Severin Hawthorne and his cousin Tatiana. The event opens with these two exploring the burned-out shell of the camp. This tragic event took the lives of a number of people, most prominent among them Atro, the doctor who Folinik is looking for, and who was running this medical camp for the infected. Biederman, the catastrophe manager who failed to get Wolumonde out of the way of that catastrophe that did huge amounts of damage, and Thorwald, Severin's son and Tatiana's lover. Don't think too much about that. Anyway, they discuss how things are probably going to get pretty bad moving forward, and they're correct. The Rhodes Island operators arrive in town and immediately notice that the infected are starting to protest. Turns out that when a medical facility exclusively dedicated to helping the infected gets burned down and the nice doctor who's providing free medical care to a group of impoverished people dies in a fire, those same people get just a little bit absolutely livid. Normally, these insurgents would be easily handled by Wolumonde's police force called the Gindermere, but they're all absent for the moment. Severin is worried that if things keep getting worse and worse in Wolumonde, none of them will survive the winter. While he initially plays dumb, Severin does show Folinik and Suzerain the bodies of those who died in the fire. Additionally, he reveals the way the fire was started, which implies that it was a deliberate act of hostility. He believes that an old force called the Winterwisps are to blame for the fire. The Winterwisps in question are a group of native people who lived in the mountains that Wolumonde mainly operates around. They didn't take too well to the colonization of their land and have operated as a terrorist group in the area, although they've been quiet for a long time. Meanwhile, the Sarkaz reunion forces are meeting up and discussing what's going on. Turns out their leader, Mudrock, is not happy about Atro's death and sees the anger of the insurgents as pretty justified. The bulk of this Sarkaz force has been sneaking around while Rhodes Island has been occupied, even going so far as to get to the town's Originium reactor, the beating heart of the city. But Mudrock's conscience got the better of them and they don't disable it. The main road, which has a name but I'm not brave enough to even try to pronounce it, is under assault by the insurgents and the Sarkaz warriors. Severin leads the uninfected in an attempt to retake the street, but suddenly begins coughing up blood. See, he's consistently been shown to have a bad smoking habit. However, his coughs aren't from his smoking, they're from his auropathy. Turns out, he's infected. He got that way because a winter wisp he was hunting stabbed him in the chest with a chunk of Originium, and he's been bluffing ever since. He's pulled back to the big townhouse that the leadership has been hanging out at for this entire event, and Tatiana takes his place on the battlefront. Around this time, Suzerain is tending to the needs of some of the wounded around the main house. There, she meets an old man who is the last of the winter wisps, who confirms that they're all gone and says Biederman, the town's old calamity messenger, was the one who started the fire at the camp. Not only that, he's still alive and didn't actually die in the fire. Other Rhodes Island agents go out to capture Biederman, but all they find is a body. Aerscarp, one of the new agents that showed up around this point, theorizes that he was deliberately assassinated by the contingency contract organization, which we'll get deeper into later. So the main culprit has been dead the entire time, and the insurgents were stoked to a boil by Mudrock, who is starting to have second thoughts about this whole thing. The natural aggression of the people in the town is all that's driving them now, and it's heading towards a calamitous ending. Tatiana does a solid job of defending the big house, but after she sees a man burn alive in front of her during the fighting, she suffers a mental breakdown. However, despite his condition, Severin drags himself back out into the middle of the fighting. By this point, Folinik and Suzerain have informed him of the situation. Severin calls out to the crowd, telling them that the man behind the fire is already dead and that further conflict is pointless. They don't listen. Things have already escalated to the point where there is no turning back. However, the leader of the reunion forces has joined the field. In desperation, Severin offers himself to die die if the reunion members and the insurgents leave once he's dead. They agree, but suzerain intervenes before the killing blow is struck. Folinik explains to Mudrock that Biederman was the one responsible for Outro's death and that he's already dead. Mudrock is convinced that further bloodshed is pointless, but the insurgents want to continue fighting. Mudrock responds by summoning up a gargantuan rock titan out of a mountain to intimidate the insurgents to disperse. In the aftermath, Severin is put in custody due to his infected nature. He gets a moment to explain his suspicion that Biederman was, in fact, not the true culprit behind the fire. However, with no more leads, the Rhodes Island personnel visit the husk of the camp where everything started. While there, they run into Mudrock and the whole group pays their respects to the departed Outro before heading their own way. However, that's not where the story ends. After everything, we're given a flashback to before the fire from Biederman's perspective. He was bummed because the town had almost no options but to go north and probably starved to death if no other towns gave them help after his fuck-up. It was made doubly worse because the town was lacking any kind of manpower to help resolve the situation because the police in Gindermere had been sent away to stand around at a noble's wedding. Overwhelmed by grief, he seals himself in his room, but Outro breaks him out and he becomes an active participant in the town again. At least until he receives a letter under his door from Contingency Contract. When he sees this, a knock comes at the door right after. An unknown person speaks to him. The Contract and this man both say that the only way to actually save the town is to get attention, and the only way to drum up enough attention in a short span of time is by causing a riot. The only way to cause tensions to flame up to the proper heights is to set fire to the camp and kill Outro and some other infected. It turns out, this is the best way forward. The way to get as few people killed and to actually keep the town of Wolumonde afloat. So Thorwald, Severin's son, pressures Biederman into starting the fire. The true mastermind behind the fire died in it. Everything that happened went exactly according to plan. And it worked! The town was saved! Sure, there was a ton of property damage, lives were lost, and those who lived are still scarred for life over the things they saw, but the town is still alive. If the riot had never happened, they would have all died a slow death of starvation, and maybe the riots would have happened anyway, well after they would have been useful. This was the good end. Swaths of people are dead, but a good end. So that's the story of Twilight of Wolumonde, and it's really fantastic. I'll get into the actual specifics in a minute. For now, we need to cover the plot of Mansfield Break as well. Our story follows this furry man named Anthony Simon, or Mountain if you're more familiar with his operator name. Now, before we get much further, I must address the allegations. If you've watched my Arknights streams, which, judging by the numbers you haven't, there's a running joke that I am, in fact, a furry. I reject this joke. The reason for this is that Mountain is my favorite character. Now, I'm sorry, but as I've mentioned during the Wonderland video, I like big characters. I tend to have fun with characters that are either wide, gigantic entities or small gremlin shitposters, and Mountain is about as massive as you can get. He also punches, has good taste in alcohol, is an avid reader, has a chill, jazzy beat for a theme, and can go into a berserker rage to rip apart a steel bulkhead. So yeah, I fucking love Mountain. He's cool as hell, and I won't apologize for that. While I personally do not believe this makes me a furry, if you so choose to see me in this light, feel free. Anyway, Anthony here has been locked in prison for some time because he's the scion of a huge construction firm. His family has been the target of a rival corporation called Hydebro, who pulled strings to get all of the Simons imprisoned in Bunker Hill State Prison, which they conveniently own, where they were all coincidentally killed, except for Anthony, whose dad pulled strings right back to get him safely put into Mansfield, out of the reach of Hydebro. However, Hydebro has sent assassins to infiltrate the prison and kill Anthony, thereby eliminating the last member of the Simon family. At the same time, Rhodes Island operator Silence discovered Anthony and sent in the operator Kafka to get him out. Kafka easily blends into the prison's environment. Turns out there are 3 main buildings on the prison ship, blocks A, B, and C. A block is where the uninfected are housed, B block houses the infected, and C block is a massive tower between the two that houses the extremely dangerous criminals. Anthony is being kept in C block under as much protection as possible. Kafka meets with her accomplice, Mina, who is posing as a temporary construction worker. We also have Robin, a raccoon girl who was coerced into breaking into the prison to participate in the assassination of Anthony. She's primarily been convinced to do this because she's the daughter of Black Cloud Trade's director, which went under due to Simon Coe's influence. Her dad has started unironically listening to sad Vaporwave Simpson videos on YouTube since, so she's seeking out vengeance for her family's downfall. During a group cleaning exercise, several assassins try to kill Anthony, including Robin.
He's just standing there, menacingly!
However, Anthony bodies the entire room of assailants without much effort. He and the assassins are sent to the infirmary/morgue to recover. There we meet Dama, who is just happy to be here. While recouping, Kafka reveals that she's in the prison to break Anthony out, and he acknowledges that while he has grown used to a life behind bars, he does want to break out to discover what happened to his family. He then approaches Robin, who he realizes is trying to kill him, and asks if she'd like to help him break out instead of, trying to kill him. She hesitates before a prison officer enters. In private, he reveals himself to be the man that hired her in the first place, and he convinces her to use the Alliance as a chance to act as the sussy imposter so that she can get a chance to kill Anthony in cameras, then call a meeting and blame it on Kafka. Sorry, got off track there. but she does actually agree to kill him again. The plan relies on the fact that Mansfield is actually kind of a shit prison. The big central C block tower can be retracted into the mobile platform during high security moments. However, if the power is cut while the tower is down there, the entire facility is basically dead in the water with most of the staff trapped. The team sets up a series of sneaky plays and things go off mostly without a hitch, getting Anthony out of his cell, trapping the guards at the tower, and Robin tries to kill Anthony again, which goes about as well as you'd expect. Anthony hears her situation, forgives her for trying to kill him, and tells her that killing him isn't the quick fix solution she's looking for, but he'll help her find a solution to her problems because he's just the best like that. While sneaking out of the prison through the morgue, the man who hired Robin is revealed to be a mercenary by the name of Jesselton. He's hired some inmates to capture Dama and tries to talk Robin into taking this chance to kill Anthony again. She throws her knife but hits the dudes holding Dama down instead. Seeing an opening, Anthony rushes Jesselton and they start to throw intense over-the-top anime hands. Unfortunately, Jesselton has an art's ability to cover himself in stone, which gives him the edge over the party. However, Saria, the leader of Rhine Labs, reveals herself as having infiltrated the prison since the beginning. Jesselton decides to throw hands with her to get even after she rejected him from her company. However, she easily bodies him through the power of her calcification arts. With this opening, the party escapes through the morgue and out into the city the prison was docked at. Now that was a pretty cool jailbreak story, right? Well, at the risk of spoiling my thoughts for later, that's hardly the entire story. Frequently, the action was interrupted by these three ladies having a chat at a bar. Silence, Mare, and Donkey Simple? Fuck it. Mibble Dibble here spend entirely too much of the story talking about the motivations and actions of the stuff going on in the prison break, which is entirely told via flashbacks. To sum it up, Mibble Dibble wants Anthony, Saria interfered with the stuff in the prison to keep him out of her hands, Silence and Mayor tell her the whole story, but don't give her Anthony. Anthony becomes the operator mountain in Rhodes Island, the end. Okay, that's two brief summaries out of the way, now let's talk about comparisons. There are 5 things that really most stories need to be good, but we're gonna look at them in terms of an Arknights event. These are not a universal set of rules for quote-unquote good storytelling, but they certainly tend to help. First off, and the one thing that Arknights struggles hardest with across the board, is a good hook. Readers want to read, but they also don't want to read if they're not given a good reason to. Some people think that a good hook is only the first thing a reader sees, and while that is important, it's more important to have the first major section be engaging and pull the reader ahead. I'll be honest here, I don't think either of these events have stellar hooks on them. Twilight is definitely better here. It opens with the burnt out campsite that Severin and Tatiana are wandering through. Frame 0, not a big pull, but as time goes on, they reveal that they're discussing a tragedy that happened here. They also talk about how they're not able to properly bury the bodies because they're infected, which is pretty fucked up. Especially when they reveal that one of the dead is Severin's son. I also love how the last sentence Severin says here is him agreeing with the desires of the people he himself deemed cowards for the sake of the town unity, all while he's breaking down coughing from what we're initially led to believe is his smoking habit, but is in reality his oropathy flaring up. Really good detail that draws a symbolic line between the state of the town's leadership and his own declining health. There's also a brief showing of Mudrock and a tie-in line to the Granny and the Knight's treasure event, establishing Mudrock as an important person for those who are already invested in Arknights events. Finally, for our first chapter and the end of our hook, we introduce Volanik and Suzerain, their relation to Atro, and send them off to Wolumonde. As for Mansfield, the intro is not some pulse-pounding overlook of the integral parts of the prison, it is Silence and Mare going to the bar and looking around for whoever invited them there. They do this for a while, and then a flashback happens showing us that, yes, in fact, they did get invited to a bar by someone they're not aware of, and then they meet Mibbly Dibbly. All three then begin spewing exposition at each other like a fire hose until we finally cut away and see Kafka learn about the blocks of the prison and a fight breaks out. I shouldn't have to tell you which of these is the better hook. While Twilight doesn't have the strongest initial hook, it still manages to naturally establish its important exposition while setting up key emotional stakes to get readers invested. There's a palpable sense of tension in the air as Severin and Tatiana talk about their town. The tension increases as Mudrock's faction is introduced right after, immediately establishing an antagonistic threat. This is followed up by the solution to said threat, our Rhodes Island operators. Granted, most of these things that a reader might assume, like Mudrock being a quote-unquote bad guy or the operators being a solution to the problem, turn out to be far more complicated as time goes on, but what matters most in this segment is the initial grasp of the situation the audience is given. Compare this to Mansfield, where almost no tension exists. The prison break that the event is themed after has already happened. We know full well that Anthony gets out even before we learn why he was in prison in the first place. Instead, we have a casual conversation between people that are literally chilling in a bar and relaxing. To make this worse, instead of naturally inserting the exposition about Anthony's family and Hydro into the prison sequences, they just have the ladies in the bar verbally explain the entire situation to the reader. The only time any actual tension is injected into the scene is when we cut to Kafka in the prison as she gets involved in a brawl, at which point the hook ends. Twilight manages to naturally grow the reader's interest in the story over the course of its hook, while Mansfield casually bats the reader across the head with exposition and then just assumes they'll keep reading. We're given no stakes, no reason to keep going. It's by far one of the worst hooks in Arknights history. However, the intro does not deter determine the quality of the overall story. For that, we turn to the rest of the script, in this case, pacing. For those unaware of the term, pacing refers to the tempo of a story, the balance between action sequences, quieter moments, character building, and character conflict. Some genres rely more on pacing than others, and due to Arknights' variable genre setting, there is no one solution to the pacing problem that can be applied to all of Arknights events. Thankfully, both of these events should ideally have a similar pace. Twilight is about the growing tension of a group of dissatisfied townsfolk boiling over into chaos, which requires a slow build into a series of rapid and dramatic moments, while Mansfield is a prison break story, a genre that has been told many times and frequently has a similar structure of building the details of a prison and the characters, the formulating of a plan, and then the drama that ensues when that plan inevitably encounters complications. However, neither story quite matches the pacing that's ideal here, although Twilight is, as usual, far more engaging than Mansfield. Twilight has a few too many dramatic sequences in the middle of the climax that awkwardly slows things down. However, these are pretty few and far between, they don't overstay their welcome, and they do deliver important exposition in a mostly natural way. Mansfield, however, is one of the best examples of how not to pace your fucking story. Holy shit, it's bad. Like, I understand wanting to do a story with a framing device where characters can interrupt the action to get some commentary, and it's been done well before. For some examples, Persona 5 has the interrogation framing device that gives context for your actions through most of the game. Emperor's New Groove is the first example to come to mind of that early 2000s, late 90s tendency for the main character to interrupt the action as a narrator and mess with stuff, and the Martian twists this concept by having the interruptive framing be mission control, happening at the same time as our A-plot on Mars, but still performing that expository purpose for the audience. All of these are better examples of having an interruptive framing than Mansfield purely because of one thing: brevity. They're short. Mansfield's waspy barroom chat is anything but. It's such an overwhelming issue that the prison break, which the event is literally named for, feels like the secondary plot at times. And they come in at just the worst times. I love being in the middle of a tense situation, wondering if the prison break is going to go smoothly, only for the bar gang to arrive and explain, yeah, basically everything happened just fine. Show, don't tell is a pretty common piece of writing advice, and one that's not nearly as universal as mid-tier reviewers on YouTube would have you think, but in this case, it's accurate. Please, show me the prison break happening. Show me the planning. It's what we're here for. Oh, and let's not forget to mention the other elephant in this incredibly cramped room: flashbacks. God, this event just loves to shove flashbacks in for absolutely no fucking reason. There are two examples of how abysmal this is. For one, the entire prison break is a flashback, but in my opinion, that doesn't count because it's the main plot of the story. Savvy viewers will remember a few paragraphs back when I mentioned how absurd it is that at the very start of the event we're told that Silence and Mara were invited to the bar by a mysterious caller and then are immediately shown a flashback of that happening. Writer, hello? You already told us this? Why are we being shown it directly? We know! Your reader has a brain in their head. They're not completely brain dead. You don't need to explain it to us like it's the ABCs. The other terrible flashback habit is any that takes place in the prison. The one that immediately comes to mind is Robin's flashback in the prison showing how she was recruited. It's not even that bad of a flashback in itself, but man, is it just another moment that shows how sloppily this event is written. Flashbacks are not inherently a poor literary device. They just need to be handled well. Flashbacks immediately take the reader out of the tension for the scene that they're in, replacing it with a new scene that needs to be properly built up and tense in its own way. I'd love to include a bit here explaining what exactly a good flashback is, but that'll take up way too much time. Just know that the flashbacks in Mansfield are too awkward a length to fit smoothly into the pacing of the event. Moving on, a story can be paced masterfully, but still fall flat without competently written characters. For the most part, both of these events do their characters justice. I've already waxed poetic about how much I like Mountain, but that's mostly just a wow, character is cool stuff, and not a measured look at how a character is introduced, how the storyline changes them, and how they drive the story forward. Twilight is the winner here, kind of by a mile, but for once Mansfield isn't actually bad about this. Mountain has the best arc, going from a passive character content to live his days out in relative comfort in the prison, to embracing his primal wrath to obtain the freedom he's been struggling for, yet these seemingly opposed mentalities aren't conflicting, they're just him. It's good stuff, and a lot of the reason I like the character so much. Robin also has an okay arc, although I personally think she waffles back and forth a bit too frequently on the whole I'm gonna kill Anthony thing. Kafka is also here, and really quickly I just want to say how frustratingly confusing it is when you've got two bird race characters and none of them are the character named Robin. Also, I hate that Kafka isn't a bug person. Too often I see the name Kafka thrown out into gacha games, but attached to a character that doesn't really link up to the literary clout the name implies. Thanks for fixing that, Limbus. Lastly, I want to talk about another reason why the framing bar scenes flop so hard. We're given almost no reason to actually care about any of the characters there. They don't go through any kind of arc, they're not in any kind of a stressful environment, and the majority of the investment the audience is supposed to have in them is because they're a part of Rhine Labs. A piece of writing advice that pops pops up less frequently is that the more stressful the situation you put your character in, the closer they come to their true character. This principle stands for Anthony, as he's put in an extremely stressful situation that reveals he can still tap into that primal rage he holds back most of the time. But the Ryan Labs characters are in one of the least stressful situations possible. So when Silence and Mayor go into the back to have a forced character building moment, it doesn't feel legitimate because the characters aren't in a stressful situation to justify that kind of a realization. In fact, this entire event feels like it was slapped together to drum up some hype about an eventual Ryan Labs event. However, if you're like me and wanted to see an event based around a prison break, you know, like what the name is, you're going to be horribly bored by all the random Ryan Labs talk. Anyway, Twilight has absurdly good character arcs here. Nearly every single character comes out of the other end of this story changed in impactful ways. Severin is fucking broken, completely used up by oripathy in the stress of trying to hold the crumbling town together. Tatiana is traumatized by the violence she saw and still tries to hold on to her peaceful mentality. Suzerain doesn't really change much, but honestly, I think that's fine. Suzu is here to act as the moral compass for the characters in a very dark situation. Her childlike innocence winds up being the glue to hold everything together. This also establishes that not all of your characters have to actively change for a story to be good. Some characters are flat, but sometimes you need a flat slope to get your round characters rolling. Mudrock also doesn't change too visibly, but there is a change there. You can see this in the fact that they actually become a Rhodes Island operator later down the line. This event was the catalyst for that decision, and while we don't get some dramatic monologue from them about their changes, we see it in the subtle ways they react throughout the story. Finally, we have Folinik, who is basically the entire story of this event condensed into a single character. She acts as a reflection for the entire town's mentality. She deals with the emotions that the whole town goes through: grief at the loss of a beloved friend, directionless rage at whoever took them from her that eventually finds an unhealthy target, and finally the bitter taste of having to let that rage go and simply mourn her loss. The one issue with Twilight's characters is that, nearly I said at the top of this section, while this group certainly goes through significant and well-done changes, there's also another chunk of Rhodes Island operators that really don't go through any changes at all. Click and Airscarp are mostly just there to say exposition about the things that they're familiar with. They occasionally make some decisions and influence our main cast in important ways, but they feel less like characters and more like plot dispensers. They're flat, but not in the way that Suzu is. The exception to this is Greythroat, for an interesting reason. See, Greythroat is present in the main story for a while as a fairly biased individual against the infected. However, she goes through changes during that chapter and comes out of it at the other end of her arc. So seeing her here, she doesn't really have to go through a transformative character arc since she's already done that by this point. She's a good example of what the Ryan Labs crew was trying to do in Mansfield. Arknights stories are not self-contained. They exist in a world that constantly changes and flows. In fact, at the top of this video, I even said that a major part of why these events exist is to show the reader the rest of the world outside of the main plot. While sometimes the writing struggles to convey this, there's almost always at least an attempt to tie the greater world into an event's plot. Twilight effortlessly includes this wider range view of the world through a post-arc Greythroat helping characters go through their arc, and by including a few casual mentions of the greater goings-on in Wolumonde's home country that eventually get picked up in later events. Conversely, Mansfield ham-fistedly slams these greater context concepts into a story that would have been perfectly fine without them, and actively hobbles the story for the sake of them. Characters form some of the most important parts of a story, but one of the most important parts of characters is their opposite, the villain. This section will be shorter, I swear. Jesselton is a decent antagonist. He pushes Anthony to tap into parts of himself he'd rather not in order to reach his goal, and that's a fine thing to do. He's a very traditional villain and does his job well enough. However, Twilight takes a very different approach, because there really isn't a villain in this story. There's hardly even an antagonist. At most, it's Mudrock, because they needed a boss for you to fight, but Mudrock eventually ends up realizing the futility of the fight and just leaves, forcing peace upon the situation. Even before then, they have a candid and casual conversation with little to no hostility toward the main characters. Yeah, they're the antagonists, but they're hardly a villain. Not to mention, they didn't cause the main conflict of the story. Now, your antagonist doesn't have to be the direct cause of the conflict, but they tend to be. Even then, Thorwald and Biederman are hardly villains. They do a terrible thing, but it's for the sake of saving the town, and they're kind of right. They have the foresight to see that if they remain passive, things would fall apart around them, so they make a hard choice to save everyone, and it works. Granted, we have no guarantee that the choice was required, but given the information provided, it was the best path forward. The only other physical candidates for the villain role would be like the nobility, and they're not even touched on during this story and are more of a factor so future events can play off this event's perception of them. So the only real villain left is a conceptual one: hunger, prejudice, grief, rage. That's something that a lot of stories don't manage to do because it's very, very hard, and it's impressive to see it from Arknights. I will say, however, that I don't think this is an inherently better villain than a traditional antagonist. Both can fill the role of a villain, but that doesn't make one an inherently stronger concept, just harder to pull off correctly and more impressive because of it. That said, Twilight's ambiguous societal level inherent to the human condition villainy does fit a bit better with Arknight's main themes. Properly pulling off this kind of villain is indicative of extremely skilled writing, and it resulted in conflict for the entire cast of the story instead of just two characters, so I'll give it the W over Jesselton. Now we reach one of the parts of a good event that Arknights has never had a problem with, the climax. Arknights has always had problems with opening its stories, but has always had great climaxes. I mean, even Part 0 has a passable climax, even if I did clown on it pretty hard in the video. Anyway, both of these events have a pretty damn hype climax to them. Mansfield might actually edge out Twilight for once here, mostly because the climax of Twilight is just kind of a conversation and then Mudrock summons a mountain. Granted, that conversation is the culmination of all the lessons the character had learned up until that point, so from a literary perspective, yeah, it's the stronger one, but a proper climax isn't just about the literary aspect. I don't pop off and pog out of my mind because a character has a quiet conversation with someone else. I play this shit to see cool anime grug brain action, and Twilight kinda has that with the previously mentioned Mountain Golem, but we don't even get to fight it, which is a shame. But Mansfield, holy shit, Mansfield got hands, literally. We get a knockdown, drag-out punch fest between Mountain tapping into his primal fucking rage against Jesselton, who is just the perfect amount of smug asshole to be a punchable face. Part of me wants to say that I'm disappointed Mountain doesn't actually get the W here because he's the main character who has gotten the whole arc around him, so it makes sense for him to get the win, but honestly, Saria rolling up and absolutely dumpstering Jesselton was so cathartic that I can't complain, even if it is more Rhine Lab wankery. Insanely hype and really damn cool. Wish Twilight had something that exciting, although it probably would have clashed with the overall somber tone for the event. I'll just say that each of these get a W here. They're both great climaxes for very different reasons that are appropriate to the tone of their individual stories. There's also a certain degree of literary interpretation that can make for a good story, but I'm not exactly trained for that. I've spent most of my education in literary stuff working in popular fiction, not literary fiction, so I'm very much so not equipped to make intelligent and measured observations about this. I'm here more for the bones and construction of a story as opposed to being able to interpret what it means on a deeper level. I'll say Twilight definitely wins out in this aspect, as there's a lot you can read into the tale, while Mansfield is pretty cut and dry with its story. So that's my big ramble about these two events. Taken as a whole, Mansfield is nowhere near as big a misstep as Part 0 of the main story, but it's still a pretty far cry from the quality Arknights needs to be at in order to compete with the story quality found in other mobile games. Twilight, on the other hand, is an incredibly good event and a great step in the right direction. It capitalizes on the unique aspects of Arknight's setting while presenting a story that we really don't see very often in other games. It's by far the best thing we've talked about with Arknights thus far, although admittedly that's a pretty small chunk of the story of Arknights. That said, I'm kind of glad events haven't really followed in Twilight's footsteps. It's a really somber event, and while that's not inherently bad or anything, I prefer more of a mix of exciting moments along with the downer stuff. I think probably one of the best examples of this is Lingering Echoes. It manages to take a lot of the strengths of Twilight, like a focus on character development and a message largely revolving around the societies of Terra, but also include with it extremely hype moments like Cerny the Giga Chad writing his soul out for a song and the final boss fight, which I won't talk too much about if you haven't played it. This isn't to say that Twilight is anything less than spectacular. I just think that if everything was following the tone and themes of Twilight, the stories would get stale pretty quickly, mostly due to the sheer difficulty of getting this more somber, grounded tone to work properly. I can't imagine Gavial or Blemishine, for example, going through the stuff that happens in Twilight. Then again, Twilight had the physical incarnation of shitposting called Click in it, so what the hell do I know? In the end, both of these events are steps in the right direction, and I hope my analytical look at them helped you understand the intricacies of how Arknights presents its story. Unfortunately, the next Arknights vid is going to be a ways out. I've been flip-flopping between Project Moon content and Arknights, but Project Moon's Limbus Company is coming out at the end of the month, so I'd like to sit down and really dedicate myself to getting caught up on their side of the fence before then. So no more Arknights stuff until March. Sorry about it. However, when we get back, we'll be covering the next major arc of the main story, which I'm dubbing the Frost Nova Saga. And boy, is that video going to be spicy, since I've got a lot of hot takes for that, which will probably get me in hot water with the community. But that's a story for later. Do all the usual YouTube stuff. I've got a Twitch where I'm streaming myself reading this content, and a second channel for VOD uploading. For now, I hope you'll join me in the next videos. After all, the library is always open.